I meant to send this to my,
All right.
to my resident. When I sent
You were like,
No, there's no room.
yeah, there's
Round squishing you together. You guys gotta have a little close moment.
apparently I was sitting too close.
Maureen, bubble, keep bubble.
Okay, I got this.
Melissa, when they go to the community comments, can you ask a question?
I know, really.
Just so somebody does.
Meeting is called to order at 7:02. Please rise and join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Need a motion to approve the agenda. Discussion. Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Agenda is approved. Next item is the approval of open session minutes of March 11, 2019.
Make a motion to approve the open session minutes of March 11, 2019.
Second.
Any discussion, any amendments, changes? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. We're approved. Next we will pass over student comments, I assume. Community comments. Is there a member of the community who wishes to address the body?
Look them all.
Yeah, seeing and hearing none, we shall move on to superintendent's comments.
Okay, good evening, everyone. First, as an order of business, I think we discussed it way back in September, but we have a rescheduled visit of the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education. It's going to be a week from today, April 1st, and he's on a very tight time schedule, so he's only going to be in district for an hour, and it'll be from 10:30 to 11:30 at Memorial Elementary School in Upton. As I say in the background notes, he is on a listening tour, so to speak, during his first year as commissioner. So he is attempting to visit as many districts across the Commonwealth as possible. So please, if you can make it, I know that you're all busy and you have very busy schedules. If you could be present for that visit, that would be wonderful. Okay. Second order of business is just kind of a review of what we did last week on Tuesday evening. We did a public screening of the film If Only, which is a film that deals with the issue of opioid addiction and abuse. It's a it's a short but very powerful film. And I think really a hallmark of the evening was the panel presentation that was held afterwards that featured the Worcester County District Attorney, had first responders from both of our communities, the Upton Chief of Police, some medical personnel, and then also a recovering addict and also the mother of a person in recovery. So I thought it was a very powerful experience. We plan on kind of building upon that and having a showing of the film for our students at the high school as well, with also some follow-up activities. But I wanted to mention, I know some of you were present for it, but to kind of mention it and give my thanks and appreciation to Leslie McGinnis, who is our school nurse at the high school, and Gail Checkaway, who's here at VISCA, for really spearheading and coordinating the entire effort.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
So I know we had the vaping presentation
Mhm.
too, was that in December?
I believe so, yes.
What have we done for our students for vaping education?
Well, a big piece is happening at the high school, and it's something that's embedded into the wellness curriculum, but I know they've also done various activities and kind of focused conversations during the advisory block with the high school students as far as getting promotional information. I know a lot of it has been published through CBS about the dangers as far as the various carcinogens that are in the vaping materials, and also the intake fluid and so on.
Have we done something at middle school as well? Just because I hear, like, there's just so much talk about vaping.
Sure. Well, it's become kind of the new smoking, and it's kind of the replacement. Yes. I'm not sure of the specifics, but I know it's been included. There's been changes to the wellness curriculum to include it. Yeah.
And now that all the kids get wellness, they'll all get an information.
Some type of exposure, but I think like anything else, it's something that it's got to be more than one hit, no pun intended. But you've got to give the consistent message to the students all throughout the year.
I agree.
Yeah, they did their like student presentations last year.
They did.
Also for vision.
That's what I thought as well. They had a speaker come in.
There were student presentations.
Yeah.
All of it.
I think that's a good approach, what you just said. It's not like just a one and done.
Yeah,
That
absolutely
it's
not.
a continuous message so that these kids are hearing that it's not water vapor and 1 joule pod is a full pack of cigarettes or whatever, I'm not positive about that statistic, but
Most people don't realize that with vaping, there's actually 2 liquids involved. One is what is referred to, nice term, vape juice.
yeah.
But then there's also in the cartridges an actual solvent, which is the intake solvent. And that is, a lot of the problematic carcinogens is
Right,
completely contained within that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece that students don't know.
Yeah. No.
I think that is definitely, they think water vapor.
Yeah,
It's just water
it's
vapor.
perfectly safe. Well, and I think the scary thing is when you have parents that also perceive it as this is something that's better
than
and
smoking.
safer. I've actually had conversations with parents who said, yeah, I got to pick my battles, and if my kid is vaping,
But not
how horrible is it?
understanding
Exactly.
how horrible it
Exactly.
actually is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so parent education as well as student education.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So a third, I've asked Jay tonight to kind of speak to some outstanding issues that we have with regard to the facilities, and then also an opportunity that we're aggressively pursuing regarding some security upgrades, specifically our camera system here at MISCO. So Jay.
All right, so let's start with the security cameras. The governor, through the surplus from FY18, designated about $7.5 million or so for security upgrades in public schools. They finally released the information on that grant about a week ago, so I've got the application. I'm in the process of filling it out. We had the company that's done security cameras for us in the past came and walked with me through this building to look at what it would take to upgrade it. The quote is about $29,000. So we're talking about, right now we have 6 cameras in this building. He's talking about putting in 57. So what it would do is cover every door, every hallway, pretty much every location in the building. The gyms, the auditorium, the cafeteria, covering as much of the building as we can possibly cover. So it's just a matter of getting the grant written, attaching the quote. I do have to get, as part of this, a signature from either the chairman of the Board of Selectmen from Mendon or the town administrator, because the school's in Mendon. and they require sign off from the local town as well. I'm not sure why, but it does, so we're gonna do it. And I'll get that into them, and hopefully we can get that taken care of, because that would solve a big problem in this building where we just don't have the proper security coverage cameras. And we just have never had the money to do it. So that's the first thing.
So essentially, we'd be looking at a very similar system here at MISCO as we just upgraded to the high school.
Correct. More cameras because it's a bigger building, there's more doors. Every door would have a camera on the outside. The hallways on the inside where the entrances are. I mean, right now there's really limited coverage. And, you know, what we have is a lot of people in this building at night. Lots of people, kids tend to wander off, run through the hallways. There is some vandalism issues. We have problems during the day with vandalism in various places or things that happen. That we need to be able to look on a camera and say, okay, we see what's going on here. It really helps. We had a situation at Clough maybe a week or two ago where there was a child in the cafeteria kicking something, but we got it on camera. You know, we can call up the group and say, hey, look, this is your, participant. We need to address this. So it's something that unfortunately, and I've talked to Officer Cinco as well, and, he gave me some good terms like active shooter and violent intruder. Those are the kind of things that the police are concerned about. But we really don't have the ability where you have a situation like that to follow them through the building, know where they are, identify the problem, move people to a more safer area. All that would be enhanced if we had this kind of system. It's something we need to do, but if we can get it covered through a grant, all the better, right?
What do you think our chances are, Jay?
It's going to be a competitive grant. I think they're going to get a lot of applications. They basically said the more detail we give them, the better off we are. I think the fact that we're going to give them a quote with actual parts and stuff like that's going to help. I'm going to get some guidance from Maureen and probably Joe on the grant part to make sure that I've written it well.
We'll just correct your grammar.
Right. Because quite honestly, writing grants is not something I do a lot of, and both of them do. But we have to get it in probably in the mail. I think you have to upload it, but you have to mail them hard copies probably by the end of this week. It's due April 3rd, which I want to say is
a week from Wednesday.
A week from Wednesday, right? So time is. I'm like 3/4 of the way through it, but they give you like 3 pages to write your narrative, and I've got like 3/4 of the page. I don't know if I need to fill up the 3 pages or have I covered in the 3/4 of the page. So that's where I'm going to go to people that like to write and talk.
So I think there was an insult embedded in that statement.
Not at all. How many slides, Joe? So that's that. Now, as far as the FY19 budget, I gave you guys a list of the issues that we've been dealing with during the course of this year. We'll start with the boiler at MISCO. So if I can go into some detail, the problem we're having with the boiler is that the oil needs to be pressurized to get to the flame to make the boilers run. And for some reason, we're losing pressure. So far, we've done everything that anybody can possibly think of, including cleaning out the lines, replacing pumps, replacing parts, changing the pump in the tank. We still haven't solved the problem. So we still are having difficulty getting both boilers to run the way they're supposed to run continuously, leading and lagging. I have no idea. I know that the $25,000 was the initial work we got done, but we've had them out here so many times. So I put $60,000 there, but I don't know if it'll be that much. It could be more because we still haven't solved the problem. Water treatment at Clough. The DEP has decided we need to put in all new equipment. That doesn't mean the equipment there wasn't working properly. It's working perfectly fine, but they've decided that you need to upgrade it. It cost us $10,000 just to have an engineer draw the design, which has now been submitted to DEP for their approval. Once they do that, then we'll get quotes and stuff on the pricing, and we'll see where that ends up. It's not going to be cheap, and we've spent a fair amount of money on this water system already.
Are they, the reason for that is just because of the water quality, or?
Water quality is fine. The equipment that we have is working fine. They just say it's 15 years old. It's time to put new stuff in and redesign.
Are they giving us a time frame to do it within?
They came and inspected it last year, and we get an email or a letter from them about every 30 days saying that we still haven't completed it, but they know. I mean, right now, everything's submitted to them, so it's in their hands when we get it back. So we're working with them. They're all happy, but we still keep getting reminders. It needs to get done, and I've told the company that we're working with that we need to get it done this fiscal year because I can't push the cost off to next year because we have enough problems for next year.
Do we have the same problem at all the schools?
No, just at Clough. We have a treatment system here for high manganese, and that's working fine. Upton schools are on town water. So that's not a big deal. This is a club thing. It has to do with chloride in the water from years ago. We have a, if you know the system there, we have a tank outside that I affectionately call the yellow submarine, but it's the potable water tank. We also have a fire suppression tank that has water in it. Both of those have to be adequately working. They all are. That's the thing. The water is fine. I mean, it's tested every week. So I know that I've seen the results. The water's fine, but they still want new equipment. So I think this is just DEP flexing their muscles a little bit, quite honestly.
So we're not paying for water in Mendon?
We don't pay the town, we pay for this system. So for example, the chloride tanks, we have to replace them twice a year and they're about $6,000 a piece. So I mean, we do spend a fair amount of money on water, especially there. Here it's less because the treatment here really involves solid water softening. So there's not a huge expense. Although if you remember when we had to put this system in, I forget if that was 2015 or so, that was about $90,000 installation to put it in.
The issue with the
Manganese.
manganese.
You know,
Correct.
quite honestly, that time I believe the limit was 30 milliliters and we were at 30.001. For that 001, we spent $80,000 or $90,000. That's the problem when you have a public water supply and you're responsible for it as opposed to the town. As far as other issues, maintenance-wise, there is a pump or a water pressure pump-like valve that controls the water from the fire submission tank, and it's all rusted out. And we have to do a test on it, and we're afraid that it's not going to test out properly. So we're getting a quote to replace that, but we're thinking that could be close to $20,000. There's also a pressure tank. So if you all have wells, any of you that have wells in your house, you have that little tank that pressurizes your water. Same thing, except way bigger. We need to replace that because the bladder is ruptured. And then lastly up there, the old oil tank from when we had oil heat, when we switched over to natural gas, we filled it with water and just left it there. The ground around it is starting to collapse in, and we're concerned that the tank is going to collapse in. So we've talked with the fire chief in Mendon and with the company, and I think what we're going to end up doing is filling the tank with concrete, putting concrete all around the whole thing and paving it down so it's solidified. Right now we've got a big steel plate because we've got a sinkhole forming and we're concerned that a car is going to hit it or a bus and not come out. So the plate is fine for now, but that's another issue that we have to have. Other expenses we're looking at, I think you guys know that we're switching from iPass to Power School. So there's a cost to transition all of the data from iPass to Power School, including paying iPass of what I think is an outrageous amount of money to get data that's historical that we don't have access to. So I need to get that paid out of this year as opposed to next year because, again, we've got enough challenges for next year. We're also switching the notification system to something called Aptigee from Blackboard Connect. And again, there's an upfront cost to transition all the data for the website and all the other information. Social studies curriculum. We, in 8th grade now is going to teach civics instead of world experience, and we've worked out a deal with the curriculum. But again, it's something we didn't have in the budget for next year, so we got to try to pay for it out of this year. SNAP is a nursing software, like data collection type system that most schools use and we used to use, but iPass had a feature that wasn't very good that we've been using for the last few years. Power School doesn't have that, so we need to bring that in as well. And then I'm estimating another 20 grand in snow removal for the month of March because we haven't paid in March yet, and we had a couple of storms, as you guys know. I'm hoping that will cover it. So we've got, you know, it's almost $300,000 when you put it all together. When I say encumbered, that means we've either created purchase orders. So when I look at the budget, that's already in essence been taken out. So we still have to come up with about $185,000 in order to make this all work. So the funding sources that I see when I say school choice, we allocated about $812,000, but right now the way the salaries have trended, we're at about $750,000. So there's a little bit of leverage there. We've got money left on our snow removal. Hopefully, my comment update, hopefully we're done with snow removal. And then heating, we've used a little bit less gas and oil this year, probably because the boiler's not working. So I think
upside to everything.
Right. So I think we've got a little bit of savings there. So we do have offsets, but it's really tight. I mean, what I would tell you is that we're going to struggle to get through the year. And, you know, I've kind of told Ken, you know, nothing else unless we have to do it. We're trying to, you know, watch every penny we're spending at this point to make sure we can get through and stay on the positive side, but it's going to be a struggle. So that would be my update on FY19. You've got the year-to-date expenditure report in your packets. If there's any questions on that, let me know. But it's a struggle. It really is. This year's been a really tight year in many ways. Mostly because of these maintenance things. I tease Ken that every time he walks in my office, it's $20,000. Questions?
The year-to-date expenditure report came out in, not the packet, but somewhere else.
I don't know, was it in the packet?
You
I
didn't
don't-
get
I
it
don't
in the
think I
packet?
saw it.
Oh, I apologize, I did not. I must have not included it in the packet.
Well, basically everything I just told you is going to be in there. It's just a bunch of line items. Other than that, things look okay. I'm still, I'm not like bleak and doom and gloom, but I think it's going to be a tight fit to get to the end.
Yeah.
All right, any further questions?
No.
Okay. So next we've got subcommittee updates, budget subcommittee. Sean?
Budget subcommittee. Okay, so we just had our budget subcommittee meeting tonight at 6 p.m. and we discussed the state of the budget discussions with towns. And we had the news from Joe that both towns have accepted the expense to pass what we're calling the MLC compliance scenario. So both towns are willing to give enough money to the school to bring us up to the minimum local contribution that the state mandates, which is very good news, and we're extremely grateful for that. That totals about $502K for $502,000 for Mendon and about $592,000 for Upton. It still leaves us about a $450,000 gap to get to level services. So our thinking behind this here is when we take a look at the situation that both towns are under and the types of burden they have just managing the town side, and the idea of passing an override is extremely bad for both towns, I would say, well, especially for Mendon. So we feel as a committee that we should be trying to in partnership with our towns and try to come up with something that the towns can support. And thankfully they've come back and they have indicated that they will support that. So we'll see how the process goes from now until the town meeting, but we've got a lot of work to do before we get down to actually where the money's going to come from and everything. As far as that $450K gap, we're looking at different sources of revenue, different increases from the state, and we're hoping that those things match. Are you going to get into the specifics of that within your presentation?
I'm going to focus more on some of the pending bills, but to kind of echo what Sean is saying, in looking at that $450,000 gap, really there's two ways theoretically to close it. There's the revenue side of looking at what's going to happen with regard to the House budget, which will be released on April 15th, and then the Senate budget in May. And is there potentially new funds? But then also the variables that, again, a large one being healthcare insurance, where we're still very actively and aggressively in negotiations with Harvard Pilgrim Health, who is our carrier. And then also other things like Norfolk Aggie tuitions, out-of-district tuitions, and so on. And it's our hope and that by some type of combination, we can close that gap, but realize 450,000 is still a fairly sizable gap to close. So it's our intent to every single school committee meeting between now and the end of the school year to provide an update. I think what we did 2 weeks ago was a prudent course of action in certifying level services. And we'll give you an update. But as Sean has noted, I think it is a significant positive that both of our communities have committed to meeting that MLC contribution, because quite frankly, it's a stretch for both of our communities. So we are very, very appreciative, but I think the end goal is to keep level services, in the full gestalt of the situation that we're dealing with.
And I think just to look at the longer term implications of what we're doing here, I think we're going to run into problems consistently unless we do have additional money committed, probably from an override. So we got to be thinking of that in the future, not this year, of course, but next year. We've got to be thinking about how we want to plan long term and making sure that the towns can support the school budget moving forward. So I look at that, and I think we're in agreement that we have to start communicating more often to the towns about what's going to be required in the future, maybe coming up with some plan that will last us not only through next year, but the following years, maybe graduate the costs out through. But we need to have some unified plan that we can work from moving forward. So that's the report.
For any questions or discussion? Okay, so next we'll move to new business. We'll pass over the facility request as our speaker doesn't appear to be present. And we'll go to the comparison of recent foundation budget proposals.
Okay, so somebody alluded that somehow they actually counted that there's 22 slides here. I don't know how that happened. But I thought it would be very beneficial. If you recall, before we had the budget presentation, Doug Johnson gave a short presentation on the Promise Act, which is being endorsed by a lot of organizations, the MTA being one of them. And I thought it would be really helpful to kind of dig a little bit deeper and get into the Promise Act and what does it mean, but probably more importantly, what are the implications for our district, okay? So I promise you I'm gonna go through this quickly. It's a situation where there is a certain degree of complexity because you're talking about the Chapter 70 formula and the foundation budget. I won't get into really the weeds, maybe just kind of the big weeds that you can pull out instead of the nitty-gritty ones. But I think it's useful, so we're kind of in an informed position to kind of talk about the basics. So every year, I think at the budget presentation, I discuss foundation budget, and I probably, in looking at the slide, I focus a little bit more on the local contribution, and specifically the MLC, and I talk about how that's determined by property value and aggregate income and so on. But something that is another factor in chapter formula, the Chapter 70 funding formula, is something that is referred to as the foundation budget. And again, keep in mind, foundation budget is the absolute floor. It's the bare minimum that the state says you need to provide education in your community. So in looking at the foundation budget, there's really three things that they look at. They look at what is your enrollment, how many kids do you have, but what are the demographics? How does it break down? How many preschoolers do you have? How many elementary students do you have? Middle school students, high school students. But then they also look at special populations, English language learners, students that are economically disadvantaged, students that have are receiving special education services and so on. So those also have different factors that go with a per pupil expenditure. Then there's also a couple other factors. There's one called the wage adjustment factor. Okay, unfortunately, that is not applicable to us. Essentially, if you think, it's only applicable to communities that are inside of 495, headed towards Boston, and particularly that 128 loop going up the North Shore and South Shore. Basically, anything that's Worcester County or west, it's just kind of flat, 100% fee. And then every year, there's usually some type of inflationary factor based upon federal statistics that's rolled into the foundation budget formula, okay? So this is just a horrible slide, absolutely horrible, but I got lazy and I didn't feel like turning it into a table and so on. But this is something straight out of last year's budget, and you can see these are the actual allocations per pupil for various categories. So for example, for every elementary student, the per pupil expenditure for this current fiscal year is $7,763.02. Okay, for a typical high school student, it's more expensive. It's $9,140.87 per kid. So that's part of the formula. Now, if you look at those two bars that go to the far right, those would be for students that receive special education services. So if a student is receiving special education services in district, it's $26,304. And if they're an out of district student, somebody who's tuitioned out, it's $27,401. Okay? You see a whole set of low income 1, low income 2, low income 3 towards the bottom there. That is an additional set of per pupil allocations that are given to economically disadvantaged students. The different classifications, 1 through 10, are the sections of the state in which they live. Okay? So again, horrible slide, I apologize. So to make it a little bit more complex, then they take each of the per pupil expenditures and they break them down into 11 categories of, in theory, how you should be allocating those per pupil expenditures in each of these 11 categories. Okay, and it's actually 10. Special ed tuition is kind of taken out. Okay, so it's by administration, teachers, teacher salaries, PD. One of the big ones that we're going to be touching upon is employee benefits and fixed charges. Essentially, overwhelming majority kind of speaks to healthcare insurance and so on. Okay, so this is kind of the, again, the weeds without getting super weedsy about it, about the state foundation budget formula. So how do we do in Mendon-Upton? So for the current fiscal year, we are receiving $12,383,786 in Chapter 70. So just kind of a different look at it, because we usually talk about target share. We talk about our contribution. It's covering about 35% of our budget, okay? And one of the things that I want to stress is in Mendon-Upton, we are not a terribly diverse district, okay? And again, when you break things down into our demographics, we have on the books 20 English language learners. So do some quick math, that's less than 1% of our student population. And for the current fiscal year, we have 255 students that are classified as economically disadvantaged. The former metric used to be students who receive free and reduced lunch. Okay, so if you do some quick math, that's about 11% of our student population. Okay, so realize, relatively speaking, we are not very diverse at all in some of those key demographic groups. So I go back to my point that the foundation budget is strictly a floor. Okay, so if we were to look at the foundation budget for this current year, it's $21,244,024. That comes out to be under $10,000, $9,767 per student. What are we paying in real dollars for this current school year? Our certified budget is $35,352,629, which you can see is a little more than $15,000 per student. So you can see the foundation budget is less than 2/3 of what we actually need to educate a child in Mendon-Upton. The overwhelming majority of districts, I think it's all but maybe 2 or 3 districts of 322 are above foundation. Okay. So I kind of want to also give you perspective before we get into the bills that are pending before the legislature that we're not alone. Okay, many districts, many of our neighbors are dealing with the same struggles that we are. Okay, so there's 322 districts across the Commonwealth. We're one of 183 that have this classification of hold harmless. And it kind of speaks to what has happened to our population with regard to our enrollment, but also our demographics. So if you'll bear with me, a group that I know probably some of you follow through social media called Support Massachusetts Regional Schools has created this short video to kind of explain what hold harmless means with regard to Chapter 70 funding. And I thought, hey, that's really on point. So. Okay, so I thought that would be very beneficial, just as kind of a, and again, I'm fully cognizant that most of you are completely cognizant of everything that's there. But keep in mind, again, we are one of 183 districts that are in this hold harmless category. Again, why? Because of a relatively flat or declining enrollment. And again, demographically, we're not a high incidence of English language learners or economically disadvantaged students. So I think you realize that, let me just put this back to present mode. In 2015, there was a comprehensive committee known as the Foundation Budget Review Commission. And they said, okay, the way we need to approach this is we need to change the foundation budget formula. Okay, and and keep in mind, we could have a very healthy debate about many areas where it needs updating, but they focused on these 4 areas. That the allocations per pupil, again, broken down into one of those categories around health insurance, was completely out of whack because it wasn't keeping up with the really high increases in healthcare insurance. How we were looking at special education was also wrong, particularly with the number and incidences of out-of-district placements. A very large influx of English language learners, not taking that into account, and then also economically disadvantaged. There needed to be adjustments. And I think we've talked about this in the past. Organizations like Mass Budget have analyzed the data on a statewide level and looking at what are the real costs of things like health insurance and special education costs versus what the foundation budget says if you look at all 322 districts across the state. So I think this slide shows FY17, that health insurance is underestimated by 1.4 billion. In-district costs for special education services is underestimated by 1 billion, and out-of-district expenses, even when you include circuit breaker reimbursement, is still off the mark by 159 million. So enormous shortcomings here in the foundation budget calculations. So I thought it'd be really interesting, and I kind of took the lead from some larger districts like the Worcesters and the Holyokes and realized we're nowhere near the magnitude. But how much are we off in Mendon-Upton in looking at some of these same gaps? So healthcare insurance, or actually putting it in the larger category of employee benefits / fixed charges, according to our foundation budget formula for this current fiscal year, we should be spending $2,412,511. Our actual employee benefits fixed charges in this current year's budget is $6,197,807. So that gap comes out to be $3 million, almost $3.8 million. Okay, to put things in perspective, just our healthcare allocation for this current fiscal year is, pushing 4.9 million. Okay, so again, that's a huge gap. And again, some of the things that would, again, not to get too much into the weeds, one of the things that we do every year is we benchmark the specifics of our Harvard Pilgrim Health Plan with the GIC. We're actually more competitive and do better than the GIC rates. So something for perspective. Another big piece is obviously special education. If you were to take a look at both in-district and out-of-district expenses for, according to the foundation budget, again, that absolute floor, it says that we should be spending $2,412,511. Our actual expenditures, keep in mind, not including health benefits like health insurance, is $6,197,807. So you can see our gap is 4.6 million. Again, tremendous gap.
Could I just interrupt a little bit? 'Cause
Sure.
I don't know if someone's out there saying, well, why aren't you spending the foundation budget then? So I just want to.
Because we have children that are entrusted in our care, and we want to
Exactly.
deliver
I just want to make sure
appropriate services to them.
Clear.
Yeah.
So it's not something where the foundation budget is, let's call it the reasonable amount that school
No.
districts
It's
should be spending.
insufficient.
It's
But it's
way,
also-
way insufficient.
But it's also unfunded mandates.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take special education as a good example, I mean, there's many different items that are actually included in that budget that are essentially dictated by law and are right in order to provide the students with what they need, but at the same point are not taken into effect or in the foundation.
And we can say special education is one of those.
Yep.
Say transportation costs is another.
We realize transportation is not
Oh,
included
it's not
in the
even
foundation
included.
budget.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
completely part and
That's a
parcel.
really good point.
Yeah,
And particularly for out-of-district placements that, you know, when you're transporting a child there and they need to have some special medical
Correct.
personnel on the, you know, in the van with them or
Absolutely.
whatever, that isn't even factored into the foundation budget.
so to go
That's
back
like such an important
to,
point.
this slide about green is the real dollars and the gold is the foundation budget. It's not based in reality. And realize too, the foundation budget was formulated in 1993, so 26 years ago.
Right.
Some tweaks made to it in 2007, so now 12 years ago. So realize it was the floor in 1993, okay?
Right.
Now it's like, is there a term, somebody who's good with architecture, for subfloor, or is it just subfloor? We're beyond subfloor.
So it's fair, if I were to interpret this, I could say that because of a number of different economic events that have happened over the past 25, 30 years, including 2008, the Great Recession, the state has actually changed the meaning of the foundation budget, or they're not fulfilling its original purpose.
True, and I would also say that it's also the foundation budget formula is terribly outmoded. Because if you were to think about education in 1993, when ed reform passed in the state, we had nowhere near the amount of incidences of English language learners. We had nowhere near the amount of out-of-district tuitions
That's a state.
or the number of needs that kids were coming to our schools with, and therefore the services that they require.
Right. Okay.
So what's being attempted through things like the Promise Act and two other that we'll discuss hopefully relatively briefly, but with some detail, is trying to update the foundation budget formula.
So it's also fair to say that this is where our funding woes, some of our funding woes come from.
Some of our funding woes, but as you're going to see, the formulas, the proposed changes in the three acts, the three bills that are being proposed, really kind of get at part of the needs of particularly English language learners and some of those other populations where we don't have a high incidence here in Mendon-Upton. But we'll get into that.
And therefore, those funding proposals don't really apply to us.
They do in some ways, but not in a very dramatic way.
Right, okay.
So this other one too, again, to give you perspective, on the books, we have 20 English language learners. The reality is this current year, we actually have 28. 8 have what are referred to as FLEPs. They're former limited English proficient. However, they're students that still need to be monitored. But our official count is 20 in this current fiscal year's foundation budget. And as a result, we get an additional $43,794 for those students. The actual money that we spend is a little under $152,000, again, not including benefits. So that's essentially 2.0 FTEs, or 2 full-time positions, plus instructional materials and supplies. The other one, again, economically disadvantaged, we have 255 students in the current year that have that classification. If you do the math, it's roughly about 11%, 11 to 12% of our total student population. The add-on amount to our foundation budget is a little under $1 million. So $933,150. Now you notice I put a question mark for the actual, wasn't because I was lazy, and I knew that I was on slide number 13, Jay. But the reality was, how do you really necessarily put a price tag on that? That you could say, okay, I maybe take 255 and multiply it by 15,000 or per pupil expenditure. I think you really would have to get into, okay, let's go through those 255 students. Let's take a look at what their needs are, how many are receiving special education services, and so on. So it's really difficult to quantify. But the point that I'm making is, you can see, relatively speaking, because we're a low incidence district, there's not a lot assessed there in the foundation budget calculation. What's being addressed, and if you followed the news, Friday was an enormous day at the State House that it was pretty much dedicated to testimony on the Joint Committee on Education of both the House and the Senate had hearings on 3 pending bills. Actually, there's a total of 17 bills. Some of them are very narrow and specific, like there's one that's specific to rural school districts. But the 3 that kind of speak to those 4 recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission are the governor's bill, the one that Doug talked about last meeting, the Promise Act, which really kind of has the largest and the broadest support as far as coalition. And a good chunk of it was authored, but also facilitated by Sonia Chang Diaz, who used to be one of the co-chairs of the Joint Committee on Education. And then the Tucker bill, who is named after Paul Tucker, has a lot of sponsors in the House, and Representative Tucker is the new vice chair of the Joint Committee on Education. So I don't want to get super weedsy here again, but what I'd like to do is just kind of go through what some of the differences are and how they address those 4 key areas. First is the whole assumption in the formula about special education, okay? In my humble opinion, what you can see, all 3 bills are identical. Unfortunately, it is, in all 3 bills, it's still an outmoded way of looking at special education, okay? Notice that they kind of get into, assumes 4% of students are in district special education. You might be saying to yourself, what, 4%? That seems a little bit low. Well, it means 4% of students that receive special education at least 25% of the day of their services. So if you do the math, it comes out to be 16%. So the assumption now becomes statewide, we're going from 15% of our students need special education services to 16%, which is accurate because I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dennis, statewide, it's,
Right at 16.
yeah, our, just so you know, we're a little bit below it. We're around 13.7% district-wide. Okay, so you can see, okay, all three bills, ditto, they're identical. Special education rates, you'll probably see the governor's budget has some more details than the others, but the governor's budget tends to be a little bit on the more conservative side versus the other. But really the key piece is the out-of-district rate of saying that the out-of-district rate for tuition is going to be 3 times the state average per pupil. Okay, so again, to go back to my really bad slide of what the average per pupil expenditure would be, you're still talking about something that would be in the ballpark of only about $30,000 in foundation budget for an out-of-district tuition. Okay, so kind of interesting. This is kind of weedsy, but looking at those different categories in the foundation budget, the governor's budget increases 2 key areas, guidance and psychological services and employee benefits of respectively increasing the rates by 4% and 7%, and increases the foundation budget rate for out of district by 20%. The Promise Act, as you can see, really targets in on employee benefits and takes those rates and increases them by 50%. So the Promise Act is the most dramatic change. The Tucker bill kind of has a different approach, and they say, okay, we know that employee benefits, the biggest chunk is healthcare insurance. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the GIC average rate and multiply it by a factor of 1.29. So to give you perspective, what do these rates actually look like? So employee benefits and fixed charges varies based upon, again, the level of the student. I think for the little guys in pre-K, it's $481 per student. And for high school kids or out of district, I'm not sure, it's about $3,300 per student. So it'd be a significant increase if you look at the Promise Act.
But in the governor's bill, that's the only one that takes into consideration guidance and psychological,
Correct, correct.
and the other bills do not.
They do not. So
And
it's
that
kind of,
speaks to SEL.
it does speak to SEL, but I would also make the case, though, that if you look at the percentage increase versus the percentage increase in the Promise Act, it's pretty dramatic.
Mhm.
Okay, so this is kind of weeds, but then it's talking about, okay, you establish these rates. How do you change the calculations from year to year? The Promise Act and the Tucker bill basically say we'll use a rolling average of the GIC increases over the last 3 years, where the governor's bill basically says from year to year after FY21, however the GIC increases or doesn't increase, that's what we go with, okay? Economically disadvantaged calculations. This kind of speaks to looking at those 10 different categories based upon where kids live in the state and how you would classify the increment. The governor's bill kind of looks to the poorest communities and bumping up that increment to 181 $4,000.56 per student, where the Promise Act kind of looks at the federal poverty level and then says, okay, we're now going to take that increment and bump it up by 50%. Okay. The Tucker bill, interestingly enough, has absolutely no language on that whatsoever and says we'll look to the Department of Ed for annual updates on poverty numbers. So, and then there's English language learner calculations. So kind of interestingly enough, the governor's bill bumps up the increment based upon where they are now at, again, the various levels, pre-K, kindergarten, elementary, and so on, anywhere between 55 and 100%. The Promise Act of probably these three is the most generous in the sense that they bump up the flat rate regardless of the level that the student is at an additional $25.37 per student. Doesn't matter. There's no differentiation between kindergarten and high school. And I think we could have a very healthy debate about who has greater needs, a 5-year-old who just came into this country or a 16-year-old who comes into this country, and how long it takes to move that student up to proficiency. Okay, I think I already showed that slide, economically disadvantaged. Okay, so kind of interesting too, that whole issue of minimum aid, if you are a hold harmless district like we are, the governor's bill and the Tucker bill does not address it whatsoever. The Promise Act does address it by saying there should be an absolute floor for hold harmless districts that at a minimum you would be getting $50 additional per student. Kind of interestingly enough, the phase-in, the governor's bill, and he's received some criticism, is to implement this over a period of 7 years. So it would go full implementation in FY26. The Tucker bill doesn't say it specifically, but they kind of use roundabout language saying that the deadline for full implementation would be 2024, not saying it could be quicker. And kind of interestingly enough, the Promise Act does not address it at all. So it's kind of people who observe these things very closely say, okay, well, that's your way of saying subject to appropriation. So kind of interestingly enough. Mass Budget has done an estimate of what it could mean to communities once there was full implementation. It's estimated that the governor's bill, based upon his estimates of the changes to the foundation budget, would be an additional $510 million. It's estimated that the Promise Act would be an additional $1.5 billion, and it's not able to make a determination on the Tucker bill because of the lack of specificity with regard to the economically disadvantaged calculations. So, what's the net of all of this? I would have to say, again, I think this is a step in the right direction, but it's very, very explicit wherever you read this that it's estimated that 75% of new funding, regardless of what bill or what combination of bill is forwarded, would be going to gateway communities. 75% will be going to 25% of districts across the Commonwealth, those with the greatest needs. I would say because of the delineation of minimum aid and some of those formulaic changes, the Promise Act is probably the best of the three major bills that are being presented and would serve us the best. So on Friday, 100 superintendents appeared at the State House, and our executive director of the Superintendent's Association, Tom Scott, and our president, Eric Conti, testified. And the key piece that, the phrase that they were advocating for was FBRC plus, which is saying, yes, we are for equity. We realize the inequalities that are existing across the Commonwealth. We are definitely not Brockton. We're not Fall River. We're not Chelsea. And we recognize that that's where the greatest needs are. But the legislature cannot do something that is a once in a generation opportunity and make changes to the funding formula and not look after, not provide for all 322 districts across the Commonwealth.
Right.
So I really think the key piece is looking at that minimum aid. If you recall, something that we're going to be revisiting, the resolution, the MASS is calling for a minimum aid of, at a minimum, $150 per student. I think I also included in your packet the recommendation from MASC, which is calling for $100 minimum aid per student per year. I would also invite you, just on Friday, the Massachusetts Municipal Association, MMA, also mirrored MASC's recommendations of $100. So I think that FBRC plus is the key piece. But unfortunately, I think, as we discussed 2 weeks ago during the budget hearing, because of where we are with minimum local contribution and our target share, I think the needs and the demands are still going to be falling on our two communities to appropriately fund education at the level that we want and that our parents expect and our community expects from the district. So I wish I had better news. Again, I think this is a step in the right direction, but it's not going to address some of our concerns, particularly in Mendon-Upton and a lot of our suburban bedroom communities like our two. So hopefully I didn't get too weedsy with that, but I think it's important to kind of look at the full picture of what foundation budget is all about.
All right, are there any questions? Any discussion points? Okay,
All right.
thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we'll move on to unfinished business. And we'll get an update from the NISCO Beautification Committee. This is done.
So we're going right along. We had the opportunity to meet with the superintendent, Jay Byer, Ken Chouanier, the head of facilities, as well as the fire chief and the fire inspector to kind of talk about what we can do, what we can't do, what are our parameters of the types of work that we can do. And of course, all of this is coming donations and volunteers from the community. I'm personally very excited about this project. Maureen saw me the other day because I think when you talk about our strategic plan, it fits so perfectly because it's reaching out to the community, the communities of Mendon and Upton. We're looking to our students, we're looking to our staff, we're looking to our families. We have just under 100 volunteers. Our parents have been incredibly generous, not just with money, but with time. I've been meeting with specialists, a couple of interior designers. We met with the visual aids, visual and audio person last week. We have 4 carpenters we're working with. So at the end of the day, this is definitely not capital needs. We're not replacing any rugs. We can't do that. But we can make some aesthetic differences and some functional differences that can hopefully make MISCO, even though it was built in 1960 and it has not had a lot of attention and it has the most students in the district passing through its halls every day. There are definitely some improvements that we can make here. That really, it comes down to sweat equity and a few donations from parents, community, and whoever else is willing to step up. So we're trucking right along in the planning process. We are hoping to tackle several projects during April break. We have a beautification meeting tomorrow evening here at MISCO at 7 p.m. in the library. I've been posting it on Facebook, if you don't mind posting it as well. But I've talked to a lot of people that are very excited about this effort and are very eager to participate and do whatever they can. So hoping we have a good turnout tomorrow. Tomorrow's the day where we kind of start organizing our work crews and getting things together to get some work done in April. So I'm gonna try to remember to take before and after pictures in some of the spaces that we're working on, but the work is very exciting, and I think our staff and our students and our administration are gonna notice some immediate differences. And Jen Mannion, of course, I forgot to mention Jen Mannion, but we've been working with Jen Mannion every step of the way, and no work will be done unless it's approved by Jay and Jen and Joe before moving forward. So I'm excited about it, and I think it's a great collaborative effort that really speaks to inspire about innovating, collaborating, getting your hands dirty with hands-on work and meaningful work. Things that are going to truly make a difference, particularly here in the MISCO community. So that's it.
Any questions?
Sounds good. See the pictures.
All right, next item on the agenda is the school committee resolution on the FDRC legislation. So in your packets, and back on March 11th, the first reading of the resolution was at that point. So do we have questions? Do we have the opportunity to endorse the Promise Act, but also support this resolution, which is a bit more in line with our district's needs? They're not.
I've forgotten what the correlation of this resolution was to what was presented by the teachers.
So realize this resolution is a direct response that I believe it was 2 meetings ago, we had received correspondence from our 4 legislators, from Representative Morady and Murray and Senators Moore and Fatman, basically saying, hey, we know that there's going to be pending FBRC bills. What means the most to you? What matters the most to you with regard to areas where we can put our attentions? So really this resolution kind of speaks to maybe some of the areas that those FBRC bills speak to, but also things that are critical to our district, i.e. regional transportation, i.e. what you talked about, that there's absolutely no reimbursement for special education transportation and so on. So when this was drafted, this really spoke to, yes, some of the Foundation Budget Review Commission recommendations, but things that also the Superintendent's Association and also the Association of School Committees also felt were important. So I think it's fine to endorse the Promise Act because again, it's
that was the presentation.
Yes, that Doug Johnson gave, and I think as far as a baseline and as far as the 3 bills, like I talked about, I do think it's the best. However, I think some of the recommendations that are in this resolution are a little bit more aggressive, and I mean aggressive in a very positive way, as far as again, the minimum increase of $150 rather than saying, okay, we'll settle for $50. That's fine. And again, there's some things that are very specific with regard to, the transportation pieces and so on.
Yep. Understood, that was what I was thinking.
So, the mindset would be, yes, it's nice to have a resolution, but then this could be in turn drafted, which I'd be more than happy to do, in letter form from the committee to our 4 representatives.
Absolutely.
I mean, the conventional wisdom is they are going to get something done by the end of June. Question is, what is it gonna actually look like?
Right.
And if this is our one and only opportunity.
Absolutely.
we better get it.
The clear message on Friday was, this is important. This is a big ask, and don't expect that there's going to be, in 3 years or 4 years, another, refocusing or recentering of the foundation budget formula. No, this is going to be something that's going to have to last us for a while.
Well, okay, so are we entertaining motions to get, to present this resolution?
Move that we adopt the resolution.
Okay, I move that we adopt this as a resolution.
Okay, Sean has moved the adoption of the resolution just read. We have a second, so it's moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Does anyone wish to amend the resolution to include the endorsement of the Promise Act as well?
Let me think. What if we had some language in there that states that we understand that this is an implicit adoption of the Promise Act objectives, while our
May I offer
requirements.
language?
Yeah.
Somewhat like the regular nature to do this, but if in sentence 2, so it begins, we, the Mendon-Upton Regional School District School Committee, welcome the opportunity to engage with state legislators as they consider the needs of our children in school districts across the Commonwealth. Sentence 2, in light of the cogent recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, we first urge the legislature to approve the Promise Act, Senate Bill 238, House 586, period. Moreover, we believe that the following priorities need active consideration. So first, we would endorse that they support the Promise Act, but also, moreover, we also want to see the rest of the resolution added in, would be my suggestion.
Yeah, except for asking a lot more than just the Promise Act.
Yeah, and if we're endorsing the Promise Act,
But it can still be amended throughout the legislative process.
Yeah, I mean, in all likelihood, the Promise Act, as it's written now, still, I'm sure what's going to actually come through is going to be something that's different. I mean, I didn't get into the details, but the conventional wisdom is the governor's bill, because it was so starkly different, and then also had some different caveats around accountability that, and then also the constituency of the legislature, that the conventional wisdom is it's dead on arrival.
So maybe if we could word it in a way that similar to what you said, Lee, but something that says that we see these following things as requirements above and beyond what is stipulated by the Promise Act. Something that makes it clear that we're saying it's different because of these things. Like, I didn't
and
see
that
much
it's not
about,
enough.
yeah, I didn't see much about circuit breaker in the Promise Act. Maybe I was just not seeing it within your presentation, but.
It's not, because realize it's speaking to foundation budget only.
Yeah, so there's a number of things in here that we're saying, look, all school districts require these things. It's not something that the Promise Act specifies. So, yeah, we're promoting the fact the Promise Act needs to pass, but we've got stipulations beyond that. That's the kind of language I think we should have, if you agree.
Okay.
Does it have to be written right this moment to approve it?
It would be helpful if you could capture at least,
Yes.
A little bit better.
A little bit better than what we've got. Okay, it makes sense.
Okay, what did you say, Lee?
we had, I actually wrote it down.
Oh, good.
Looking at the start of the second sentence, in light of the cogent recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, we first urge the legislature to approve the Promise Act, and then put what it is in the House and the Senate. And then she had, next sentence, moreover, we believe the following priorities need active consideration. And so on.
As long as we have something that says active consideration now and not at a subsequent time,
Yeah, I think.
we're not just advocating the Promise Act, we're saying these need to be included within.
Well, but if you look at the rest of the sentence, Sean, it says in any budget outcome for fiscal year 2020 and beyond.
Okay.
Would you feel better with the now in
Immediate
there?
consideration,
Oh,
urgent
2020
consideration.
is fine, I guess, that's fine. Urgent consideration.
Urgent consideration, active and urgent consideration.
I hate editing in public.
Yeah.
So does it make sense maybe to somewhat edit it over time and then just come back and put it in place for next meeting in 2 weeks?
We could do that, yeah, we could definitely do that. My concern is trying to get this off to them sooner rather than later. Correct me if I'm wrong, we meet 2 weeks from today, which would be April 8th. If you think about the timeline, with the House and the deliberations and so on, it's probably better to get something off to them definitely by the end of this week.
So are we saying, could you repeat that in light of the,
I'll write it out for you and hand it. to
thank you so much. Because I'm trying.
Okay,
That's fine.
so. let's see. Go on. All right. So it's been moved and seconded.
With the addition that
Okay.
we just agreed to,
All
right?
right, so is there a motion to accept the amendment?
Very good.
Right.
I make a motion to accept the amendment,
Second.
to
Okay.
change the language.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Okay, no further discussion. All those in favor of the amendment to the resolution,
Yeah.
signify by saying aye.
Yeah.
Aye.
Okay. And now on the original resolution, so that's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the original resolution? All right. Hearing none. All those in favor of the original resolution signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, so it's been passed unanimously, the resolution as amended endorsing both the Promise Act and urgent and active consideration and hopeful passage of our specific recommendations.
Cool.
Cool.
Now if it can just happen.
Yeah, now my magic wand worked.
Right.
That worked.
Shake
Okay.
the genie bottle.
All right.
And again, think about the whole piece around regional transportation, that every 10% of reimbursement is a little over $100,000 to our districts. So every little bit in thinking about closing that gap means a lot.
Does it, we've already made this resolution, does it help if we have separate letters written to our congressman to make specific requests like that?
I think every little bit helps. Every little bit helps. I mean, do you mean separate from all 6 committee members?
Well, it doesn't matter, just something to emphasize the points that were, there's supposed to be mandates from, or there were supposed to be requirements from the state, or I don't even know what to call those things. There's supposed to be requirements of the state to supply us with the funding in those areas,
Of
right,
course.
which they are not fulfilling, which has to be making a lot of school districts angry at this point, the regional school districts angry at this point.
To come back to the unfunded mandates.
Subject to appropriation is the caveat that always
Yeah,
appears in
that's
the law.
a loophole
Exactly.
out.
Yeah.
But again, and I think we use the term in this resolution, it's an unfulfilled promise.
Well, it's also a requirement that builds and builds over time to the point where now you can't afford the operation of your school if you let this go run amok.
Yeah.
So they're going on an assumption that we have enough money to do these things, and they haven't supported us with the money to do them.
Okay. Other comments? All right, next move on to correspondence. Is there any correspondence?
There is none.
All right, everyone should have received a flyer about the Day on the Hill, which takes place on Wednesday, May 1st. If anyone is interested in attending, again, continuing this dialogue with our legislators and if your interests known, they are to contact you, Joe?
Yes, contact me and we will get you registered.
Great. Okay, are there other matters not anticipated by this committee within 48 hours of the posted meeting? No, of none. So hearing none, we'll move forward. Future agenda items include a status update on the 2018-19 district action plans on April 8th. Okay, would you want to entertain a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned at 8:26.
Wow, it seems a lot longer than that. A lot more than that. Hour and a half.
What were you just nominated for executive?
I'm on the
board of-
executive committee of our